we're going to go to our guest speaker. So let's hear a little bit about Ted. Ted, he's not a soldier, but he's a soldier's storyteller. He's not a veteran, but he's recognized by vets as the keeper of the flame. He has published 18 books, half of them wartime histories. He's worked as a broadcaster for 40 years. Have you retired yet?
I retired from teaching, and I'll explain that as part of my presentation.
Okay. He's taught journalism at Toronto Centennial College for 18 years. His book, On the Great Escape, won the 2014 Libris Award as the best nonfiction book in Canada. And his last book but one, with Dam Busters, and he has that one here, won the 2018 RCAF Association NORAD Trophy. So let's give a big welcome to Ted.
Thank you very much. Good. Anyway, thank you for coming out tonight, and for this is like my second or third visit. Third. Good.
Third.
It's maybe the fourth.
Maybe fourth.
Don't you guys know when to stop?
You keep writing books.
I got to stop writing books, I guess. Yes. Okay. Thank you very much. You want me to pause around 20 after 8, you said?
Yeah, between that and 8:30,
Okay.
somewhere in
Remind me
there.
when we sort of get close to that.
Okay.
And
I'll wave my
try to-
hand.
Sure, that'll be great. This most recent book is probably one that has taken me through the longest journey. I've mentioned probably before to you that I've interviewed somewhere in the neighborhood of 6,000 veterans over my 45 years of doing this. This is actually my 19th book. And it began, I don't think I would be too stretching the point to suggest to you that it began 56 years ago, when I was 13 turning 14. It was the last day of school. Remember in our high school days, when we got down to the last few days of high school in June, there was nothing left to teach, right? So we had a phys ed teacher who said, here's a ball and bat, and you guys go out to the diamond and play workups. Remember workups? You started off in left field, and then when the batter was out or a runner was out, you moved up one, you moved up one, you moved up one, and finally got a chance to bat. Anyway, this is a Friday afternoon in June, last day of school, and I got to shortstop, which is my favorite position, and a pop fly in infield, and the catcher and I both went for the ball. And we collided at the mound, and I was out cold for about 2 minutes, lost my 2 front teeth, smashed my nose, a mess. And I go home after various stitches and whatnot, and I'm feeling really sorry for myself. My father, some of you will be familiar with the name Alex Barris. Yes? Good. 1 or 2 of you? My dad was, thank you. He would
Barris beat.
That's right. Wait, it's coming. Anyway, Dad's experience took him through various forms of writing. And he ended up being a freelancer, which meant that he was doing a lot of different things, kept a lot of balls in the air, as it were. Anyway, Dad had just become a freelancer about the time I got into this smash up, and he was working at home. So he would come in and humor me because I was feeling really badly for myself because summer holidays were starting and I was going to be laid up in bed for a few weeks. So that's when I popped the big question. I said, Dad, what did you do in the war? And of course, those of you who know his name or know his writing or his style, or as you do, the Barris beat on television, he was a great storyteller. So Dad would start to tell me stories. He regaled me with lots of funny stories, things that were not anywhere near what his reality was, but would satisfy me under the conditions, the circumstances. He told me about how, they hated the cook and the cook hated them back when they were in basic training. Bear in mind that my dad was born in the United States, in New York, so his wartime experience was in the American Army. It was after the war he came to Canada. And in basic training, after breakfast, he would be given 2 sandwiches. a peanut butter sandwich and a bologna sandwich. And he would look from breakfast until lunch for a guy who hated peanut butter as much as he hated bologna, so he could have 2 peanut butter sandwiches for lunch. At the end of the war, when they were stationed in Czechoslovakia during the occupation at the end of the war, they stole a jeep to get to Prague, which was in the Russian sector. He'd always wanted to go to Prague, so that was how they got there, among the funny stories. And then at the end of the war, Dad was in Marseille. He came through the war without a scratch, and he's waiting for a Liberty ship on the south coast of France in Marseille. And when the Liberty ship arrived, they all piled into a truck, came down to the wharf. He's getting out of the truck. He trips over the tailgate, falls down on the wharf, cracks his arm, scratches his head, gets a sling and a bandage, and gets put on this ship. Well, clearly, the sprained wrist or whatever it was didn't affect his crap shooting hand because he made a lot of money coming home. And then when they got to New York, when the Liberty ship pulled in, the first off the ship were the wounded. So off he comes, and of course the Sally Ann ladies are there. Welcome home, soldier. Thanks for restoring Europe's democracy, blah, 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 blah. And of course he tripped out of the back of the truck as the wounded. So those are the stories he told me. And then he gave me, I asked him, did you get any acknowledgement for your service? And he gave me a ribbon with a gong on it. And nothing more was said. So that's what the sum total of my early education of my father's experience in the war was. Bit by bit, because we co-authored 2 books and wrote many scripts together and appeared on radio and television often, we got to know each other as writers and historians, and we shared more. But the journey was a long one, which is why it's 56 years long, getting to the final story. So Dad's story becomes, my father's story, Alex's story, becomes the thread for the book. I used his story as an excuse to explore other wonderful stories that I've integrated into the book from among the interviews that I've done and the researching I've done to bring them out. There are hundreds of stories in this book. My dad's just the backbone to it. So let's start with the notion that some of these people in military medicine are rather iconic. For example, John Mccrae, the man, of course, who wrote In Flanders Fields, which we'll be reciting in 6 days. But more than that, he represents a fascinating story. In the Great War, it was very quickly understood that medical services were going to be required quickly in France. And so somebody got the bright idea that they should scoop up the medical schools, training doctors in Canada, and transport them to France, making the professors and the teachers in the training schools, the medical officers, and the orderlies, the students, would become the orderlies in the hospital. And they took along nurses, and they literally, in the case of McGill, which was the hospital, or at least the training school that I was exploring, they picked up 1,700 people, moved them to France in the spring of 1915, plunked them down, and they became No. 3 Canadian General Hospital in the Great War. And because Mccrae was already overseas with the artillery as a medical officer, he rejoins his McGill confreres as part of No. 3 General Hospital. And it's there that he serves as a medical officer, treating wounded behind the lines on the front and contributing in other ways, such as, we know, his literary flair in writing the poem. Edith Cavell, name familiar to you? Famous nurse, British-born, serves in Belgium during the Great War. She is involved in ferrying Allied troops who happen to be in German-occupied Europe across the line back to the Allied side. She's caught doing this by the Germans, arrested, charged with treason, brought to trial, found guilty, sentenced to death. Big uproar across Europe trying to save her, which fails, and she's executed. And she becomes, as a result, the martyred Edith Cavell. We in Canada have recognized her. Do you know how and where?
There's a mountain.
A mountain in Alberta.
It's supposed to be named after an American president, but he didn't show up on the day of the event.
I didn't know that.
So they turned around and said, the heck with him, we're going to name him Edith Cavell.
Perfect.
Yeah.
One of the nursing buildings at the Toronto Western Hospital
Is also named after her. I didn't know that either. Thank you. You see, you folks are...
Retirement center in Lethbridge.
Sorry?
Edith Cavell Care Center.
So all over the place we recognized her. That's great. I was in Britain about 3 weeks ago, and I happened to be just off Trafalgar Square, And there's a huge statue of her in her memory and a plaque. In any case, her story is well known, and it's in the book. Now, Desmond Doss is a story that came to light in several years ago when this movie Hacksaw Ridge came out. Any of you see it? It's a pretty grim movie. It's tough to watch. But it's the story in effect, and the movie relatively accurately describes this young man in America who, because of his faith, is a conscientious objector, does not want to bear arms. He still wants to serve, and he has to go to court in order to get the right to serve his country. Great story, and in Okinawa, in the Pacific, he saved something like 76 men in the course of one siege on the battle scene, on the battlefield. An extraordinary story. That's some of what are iconic moments in military medicine. How about this one? Whoops.
Watch all those.
Hang on a second. I got to plug in the audio here. I forgot to do that.
Oh, suicide is painless?
Remember the theme, right? And in the 256 episodes of MASH that we lived with, laughed with, and discovered the Korean War in effect. All these great characters who were in our living room for 12 years, and we watched this, and it became part of our culture, right? So that's some of the way that we have recognized military medicine in our lives, right? Now, I don't imagine that those of you who do know my dad's reputation as a writer and a broadcaster and so on would be too familiar with some of the details. These folks expressed their interest. Dad came to Canada in 1948 and wrote the Barris beat originally for the Globe and Mail, and then moved over to the Telegram. Remember the pink telly? Right? He was with that paper, and then he moved to television and radio, was quite the jazz buff. This is a shot from our recreation room in Agincourt where I grew up. And all those albums, because Dad was following these jazz greats constantly, are all autographed by the artists. If I get some time at the end of my talk, I'll tell you what happened to that wall later. Anyway, he was also a host of his own show, The Barris Beat. Here's a little clip from the show.
And here is our man on the beat, the entertainment columnist, the Globe and Mail, Alex Barris.
The lines in your set, don't accept this, my new deck.
He pioneered something called late night television talk shows. Huh? Hello? Wow. They're all over the place. Now, nobody else was doing except Steve Allen in the States. Dad picked up the idea, and the Barris Beat in television in Canada was born. He pioneered the concept, and it was a very successful show. It won him some awards and so on. But he loved the idea of being with entertainers, interviewing them, writing stories about them. Later, he got the Order of Canada because he chronicled more than anybody else the lives and emergence of Canadian musical artists in this country. That's why he was recognized. But let's go back to a time in the States when he was growing up in New York and there was a war to be fought. Dad was born in 1922, and when his draft notice came to him in New York City in September of 1942, he was 20, he filled out the papers, sent them back, and waited for some response, which didn't come. Honest Al goes down to the draft office to find out what the heck the problem was. Turned out they'd lost his file. His sister was so angry with him. Why did you go? You could have sat out the war and no one would have known otherwise. But he was honest enough to pursue the papers, find out what was required, and not unlike Desmond Doss, not driven by his faith, but probably understanding his own psyche. I don't think my father wanted to bear arms either. And so when they said, what do you want to do? He said, what do you need? And they said, medics. So they made him a medic. Notice his occupation, sewing machine operator. Explanation. My grandmother, his mom, Katie, was a seamstress. She stitched together fur pelts in the fur business in New York. She didn't own the fur business. She was simply we refer to it as a piecemeal worker, right? That's where that comes from. She stitched them together. But she was so good at it that the trickle-down business involved the rest of the family. Dad, his older brother, his older sister got involved in doing some of the lining stitching, which was simple. And so he put sewing machine operator in there, which I'm sure when they looked at it, they probably came up with something, some conclusion like, if you can sew the lining of a jacket, you can probably suture a patient. You're a medic. And so they sent him off to medic training in Kansas, what Dad referred to as the ends of the earth, about as far from civilization, New York City, as you could get. And that's where he spent his winter of 43, 44 training. Now, Dad would be the first person to tell you that he didn't consider him seriously as a medic, because he learned anatomy and first aid, and that's not medicine. He would learn to be a medic in Europe on the job when he had to, and I'll get to that. Dad leaves America in the winter and spring of 1944, lands in England, and then is transferred across the Channel to the same spot where his American compatriots landed on June the 6th, 1944. He landed on September the 6th, 1944. He recalls there was wreckage on the beach still from Utah's assault on the 6th of June. But now, the Allies are now sweeping across Europe, liberating Paris and on to Belgium. Dad's unit is transferred down to Brittany. You may notice that I've got a small necklace that I'm wearing with the 94 on it. Dad's unit, or his division, was the 94th Infantry Division, and he was with the 319th Medical Battalion attached to the 94th. So it was a full division, and they were sent to Brittany to essentially do two things: to keep two German armies from breaking out of their positions at a little place called Saint-Nazaire and Lorient. Anybody know what was there? Submarine pens. These were the massive submarine concrete caves that were protected by two German armies. Dad's job was, or his, the 94th's job was, to keep those German armies in place, not moving, while the rest of the invasion was going on. And he could have sat out the war there because nothing happened. Except that on December the 16th, my dad was in Paris on leave with some of his medical pals. They went out for drinks and dinner and some shows, and they came back to their billet, and the place was going crazy. And Dad said, "What's the matter? What's going on?" And he said, "Don't you know?" "No, the Germans have broken out in the Ardennes." Meaning that despite the invasion's success, the Germans came across the German border, back into Belgium, and were pushing for Antwerp to drive the Allies into the sea. This was the beginning of the most famous battle of the Americans' experience in Europe, the Battle of the Bulge. And my dad was thrown into the middle of it because they moved from sleepy little Brittany right into the Battle of the Bulge. Here's a map there. Essentially, the Germans came across here on December the 16th, stormed towards Antwerp, and were not stopped for 100 or 125 miles. And my father's 94th Infantry Division and Medical Battalion were pushed into duty under George S. Patton. He was the general in command of the 94th. And as such, he had absolutely no concept of what my dad's division needed. This was the coldest winter of the war, between December and March of 44-45, and my dad's units had no winter clothing, no winter boots, no air cover because it was constantly snowing, and no tank support. And they pushed the Germans back into Germany by brute force. That's where my dad learned how to become a medic. Can you imagine a kid from New York having to deal with frostbite? That was his first introduction to medical corps work. And he comes across the border, and his mettle was tested at a place called Camp Holt's Woods, which is just inside Germany. You can imagine the Germans having broken out in December and now pushed back into their fatherland, they would relinquish in Germany nothing. And so they had a huge defensive network ready for anybody who stepped into Germany. And that's where my dad ran into it, in Camp Holt's Woods. This is just beyond the border, and this little town of Bourg where my dad's first aid station was. And this is where, in mid-February, my dad learned how to become a medic. and it was horrific. I'll get to that later. I mentioned earlier about my father's not taking himself seriously as a medic. As it turns out, many troops are not particularly cognizant or sympathetic of what a medic tries to do. In fact, I met this man, Jody Middick, who served in Afghanistan in the Canadian Forces. And he's the man who wrote the book about his experiences as a sniper in Afghanistan a few years ago. He told me in a long interview that as far as he was concerned, medics were like mommies. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, they're always going around saying, did you get enough food tonight at supper time? Have you got clean socks for tomorrow's march? Have you written mom lately? Like mommies. And the infantrymen hated them because they were a pain. And wherever they were, death was. They didn't want to have anything to do with medics because they were death. So it was almost like, you know, a bad omen if they were around. This man wanted nothing to do with medics until January of 2004, when as a sniper he stepped on an improvised explosive device, blew off his right foot, later would require the removal of his left foot, and was losing blood in a horrific rate. Then what did he want? A medic in a hurry. And the medic who came to his aid was a woman named Alana Gilmore. And there she is with her Bison ambulance in Afghanistan. Notice she's on a turret on top of the ambulance, armed. Right?
Soldier first.
Yeah, not originally, because medics, up until the middle of the century, around 1939 to 45, until that time, medics were uniformly and universally protected by the Geneva Conventions. If a man or woman is not armed and is wearing some sort of Red Cross insignia, they are immune from fire. Well, didn't always follow that way, and about halfway through the Second World War, much of this was thrown out the window. After that, yes, first job soldier, first job defend the wounded. That's what she said. Her first job is to protect the wounded, then deal with their wounds. But in Afghanistan, you don't just jump into a Bison ambulance and rush to the middle of the problem, because in Afghanistan you got to be more careful. They have a longer process getting there. They use these devices, Badgers, like bulldozers, to go through areas where there would be mines. So it took Alana Gilmore the better part of an hour and a half to 2 hours to get to Middick before she could actually dispense her medical attention to him, right? So they bulldoze their way in, the Bison follows, this is the ambulance, and it's their job to get Middick the hell out of there to a medevac Black Hawk helicopter. So from Badger to Bison to Black Hawk is the course of action. So this is what I learned in my conversation with Alana Gilmore. Fascinating, fascinating medic. She said she'd trained for 12 years for this night. I said, what do you mean? She said, well, I had to be able to do what I did for this man without even thinking about it. I have to be able to identify, recognize, and treat without any sense of my hands moving, my body responding. All of this she did by what she referred to as muscle memory. The only way I can describe this in terms that maybe you'll understand better is to remind you all, and I went through this myself, how we all learned to ride a two-wheeled bicycle. Right? First time we got on it, no balance. Hands didn't know what to do, feet didn't know what to do. And we tumbled and tumbled until we were able to coordinate our bodies, and then we did it without even thinking about it. So that we're riding a bicycle now, looking for cars, looking for pedestrians and curbs and so on. That's what she was doing. When she got to Middick, her hands are moving, dealing with the tourniquets and the IV and all the things he's going to need in that moment of peril, but she's looking like this, taking in the environment in which she's working. She's got a split focus. She's not looking here, she's looking there, but she knows what she's doing here. And I thought that was a brilliant stroke of understanding how medics work. If they're skilled enough, and most of them were, they could do that, especially now. Anyway, she got him out of there to a medevac. He got home safely, or out to the Kandahar for surgery. They later married. Yeah. They're not married anymore, because marriages in the military are often difficult phenomena.
Stressful.
Very much so. And so they're still raising 2 kids together, but not as a married couple. Anyway, my point is, this woman illustrated the incredible skill that's required to be a medical person, whether it's a nurse or a medic or a surgeon, whatever. Medics also need a skill in innovation. Case in point, Cloutie Mcpherson, a name I suspect you've never heard of. This man was a medical officer in the Royal Newfoundland Regiment in the Great War. He arrives in Belgium at Ypres, the Ypres salient, which was one of the bulges in the Western Front during the First War, at exactly the time the Germans released chlorine gas in the sector against the Allies, using the prevailing winds to rush this gas towards the Algerians, the French, and the Canadians. The Algerians and the French run because of this horrific green gas. The Canadians hold their ground. And you may remember, how many of you read Timothy Findley? The book called The Wars. The protagonist in the book screams at his men in this situation. Take out your handkerchiefs. Pee into them. Put that over your nose and mouth. And the ammonia will crystallize the chlorine gas. That was the only effective antidote they had in that horrific moment to protect themselves.
So make sure
Mcpherson was there, not in the gas. He saw the gas from a distance, and as a medical officer, he realizes something must be done. He volunteers to come up with an antidote, something to protect the thousands of men who will face this yet again in the days following this original attack. So he recalls a process and a method of treatment from his days in Newfoundland. He remembers a hood he used to make to protect people who were injured in Labrador, transporting them through cold weather. This hood protected the injured person from the cold, and if there was a head wound, the wound from being infected, or more so than it might be. And he suddenly remembers this hood and gets a nurse to create a prototype. They're just behind the lines at Saint-Omer, and they have a gas chamber there and a laboratory where they're working with his suggested idea for this hood. They get a volunteer. Guy steps up and says, I'll try the hood in the chamber. They put it on him and they shove him in the chamber and they put in this chlorine gas, and he's in there for several minutes and he can't tell that there's any gas in there, and he takes off the hood to say, hey, when are you going to put the chlorine gas in here? They quickly open the door, haul him out, and he realizes the chlorine gas was in there and the hood had protected him, because Viella cloth, for those of you who don't know, is a fascinating fabric which is a blend of cotton and wool in a very dense material. And so that density protected the inner side of the helmet from the gas. It worked. So now he takes the helmets, or the Viella cloth, and heads for London, and with mica visors, these sort of plastic inserts for the eyes, he starts to mass produce these anti-gas helmets in London. Problem. Suddenly the mica visors are cracking because they're too brittle. The processing of this mass assembly line is forcing these things to break, and it's not working. By coincidence, he goes to a lecture being given by a man named Harry Batterby, who's lecturing in London on a new invention that's saving movie theaters from horrific fires. In the early days of motion picture theaters, an arc lamp was focused on the film in a projector, a flame. And if the film came too close to the flame, it broke into fire and often burned down movie theaters. This invention, triacetyl cellulose, a plastic cellulose film on which would be the information of the motion picture, was non-flammable, and it was flexible. Eureka moment for Mcpherson. This could be a visor. And so he finds out where this triacetyl cellulose is manufactured, back in Paris, crosses the channel, goes to Pathé, convinces them to give him 10 boxes of this stuff, which has to be now transported back to London. He loads them into touring cars and makes for between Paris and Boulogne, where there's a ferry waiting to take this secret substance back to Britain. The problem was the weight of the boxes in the touring cars, and the touring cars broke down, one by one by one by one, and he gets halfway to Boulogne at a place called Abbeville, and he wakes up the quartermaster in a British garrison. The quartermaster's never even heard of Newfoundland, much less a Newfoundland medical officer, but Mcpherson convinces him to get a truck, in his parlance, a lorry, to go back down the road, spot these touring cars, haul the boxes, put them in the truck, and get them to Boulogne by the next morning, which he does. Over the channel, Folkestone, back to London. Now all this non-flam film is back in London to be inserted into the visors of his anti-gas helmet. And the production line continues again. This is all in the matter of days. And now he has to answer to the man who's head of the Royal Army Medical Corps, none other than Sir Alfred Keogh. And Keogh says to him, "So, how are you managing?" And our friend Mcpherson says, "Well, it's been difficult." Understatement of the century. He says, "Have you got enough raw material for 200,000 helmets?" And Mcpherson said, "Well, it was so odd and so difficult, I thought maybe I better make 1,000,000. Keogh said, "How dare you be so presumptuous?" Mcpherson said, "Because I thought it was in the public interest, sir." He said, "Why didn't you make 5,000,000? He made 22 million. And within weeks, they're on the heads of the soldiers who are using them to defend themselves against the chlorine gas and later the mustard gas. Saved thousands of lives. But Mcpherson didn't have time to sit around and watch any of this. His Newfoundland regiment was in Gallipoli, and he was reunited with it, another bloodbath in the Great War. But an incredible story of thoughtful preparedness, speed, dexterity, innovation of a medic to come up with an answer to solve a problem. Amazing story. Never taught that in history class, I don't imagine,
No.
as we should be. I wanted to talk about other aspects of nurses and medics that maybe are not as familiar to you as they might be. This is a story that was brought to me by a lady who has joined you this evening, Donna Henderson. Do you know Donna? Donna lives in the area, and she and I connected many, many months ago, and she gave me this story. Her grandparents, Louise Ann Spry and Frederick Charles Lely, had no connection with each other until the war happened. Fred was actually born in Britain to a very abusive family. His parents die young, and he's shipped off to an uncle who's abusive. And after a while, Fred, when he has the wherewithal and the capability and a little bit more age, runs away. He joins the Merchant Navy, convinces a captain that he's quite agile and capable to do everything from sewing to cooking on board a merchant ship. And away he goes to see the world. In 1914, he's in Quebec City. And he's shipped out on a ship coming out of the St. Lawrence. He's in the bakery, on board the ship, when suddenly the ship shudders. And he realizes there's something wrong. And the ship begins to roll, and he takes his buddy in the bakery, and they crawl through some channel to get to the exterior of the ship and leap into the St. Lawrence. This ship is the Empress of Ireland, which sank in a matter of minutes and killed 1,000 people. 485 were saved. 2 of them were this Fred's friend and himself, because they went down the river on debris and were saved the next day, I think, or a couple of days later.
11 hours they
Yeah.
floated
Down the river. And having eaten up one of his 9 lives, Fred goes off to England in the service and becomes part of the medical corps, not as a medic per se, but as a cook in a hospital in Britain.
First he goes to the front.
That's right. He actually served on the front and was gassed.
Yes.
And in his recuperation, they discovered he's a good cook, and they shift him over to cook the food at a hospital in Britain. Back to Canada, where we learn that Louise, born in London to a very poor family, wishes dearly to study and become a nurse. Gets hooked up with training at the Toronto General Hospital, right?
Yes.
But she's so poor that she fears she won't have the equipment that she's going to need for training, including a nurse's uniform. Overnight, her mother takes some linens, I think curtains and other things, and actually makes her a uniform which passes and allows her to have some of what she needs to serve as a nurse. Her training elevates her through the hospital to such a time and place and need that she too is shipped overseas as a nursing sister in England. By coincidence, she ends up at the same hospital where Fred is the cook. And Fred is told, under no circumstances do you fraternize with the nurses. Hands off! Well, as we all know, when there is a relationship to be had, there's no way you stop people from finding a way. And Fred and Louise found a way, and they eloped in June of 1918. This is a picture that Donna got for me through the Toronto archives of their wedding.
Yeah, because she was an officer and he was an enlisted man.
That's right, he was still a sergeant.
Yeah.
So that further complicated their getting together, but they found a way. What's fascinating to realize is, as they left their service at St. Paul's Anglican, they went on a very short honeymoon. They hopped on a train. The train, coincidentally, tragically, is derailed. So in the midst of the derailment, as a result, there are casualties. Who springs into action? But Fred and Louise. And one of the people on board the train is a military officer who seems a little suspicious of these people who seem to be so capable of dealing with the injuries. Anyway, very quickly, they patch him up and get him shipped off so that they can get him the heck out of their lives and carry on with their honeymoon. They come home ultimately and raise a family here, and an extraordinary pair of lives come together because of the Great War. And as I say, that story very briefly is what Donna shared with me, and she shared with the Toronto Archives where I found these pictures. So I owe you a great deal for having this wonderful chance to tell their story, among many. Also from the Great War. How are we doing for time?
I think we could take a quick break.
Want to take a short
here?
break?
Okay.
Okay.
I
Like how
also
long?
have Louise's cape.
Oh, right, I forgot. Yes.
Which she went over in 1917. That's the original cape. It's been relined for me. And I also have my grandfather's medals, which my brother had in a shoebox. So I will put them out, and you're welcome to look at them.
How long shall we take?
15 minutes?
Okay, good. I've got some books here. Yeah, we'll manage.
It was still picking up, so.
Yeah. Anyway, let's go back to my dad's story. My dad passed in 2004. We had shared a lot. We had come to understand, or I'd come to understand some of his career in the medical corps. But I realized after he died there was more to go. And when I tracked down the 94th Infantry Division and their archives, they were at the University of Georgia, Athens campus. I went down there, spent several days in this wonderful rare books library, and started to go through all kinds of files, boxes and boxes and boxes of stuff. I never found anything specifically about my dad in the 319th Medical Battalion files, but I found context. Remember I mentioned to you that my dad was in the Battle of the Bulge in the winter, and particularly faced a difficult time in February of '45. When I was at the archive, I came across the records of the 319th daily for that period and what happened there. So it helped me give it a sense of what my father went through. Among other things, I learned that the 319th Medical Battalion, between 9 a.m. and 9 p.m. on one day, the 10th of February, '45, dealt with 119 wounded men. I did the math. That's one man wounded every 6 minutes coming into the first aid station. which is what my dad, as the runner, the front guy on the bringing the wounded in with the stretcher bearers and corpsmen, would have witnessed on this cold winter week, right? So the other thing I found out at the archives is that there were still medics alive connected to the Historical Society who had served with my dad. I had to try to find them, and I copied the lists. I went back to my home in Uxbridge, and I began calling. And I called and went through a number of dead-end calls, line disconnected, no longer in service. But when I got this man's name, Anthony Malachi, and I called him in New Jersey. First I got a voicemail and left a quick message, and then came back in the evening on the phone and called again. A woman answered. It sounded young enough, the woman sounded young enough to be his daughter. I said, "Is this Tony Malachi's daughter?" She laughed. She said, "No, it's his wife, Sharon." She liked that. So she passed the phone to Tony, and he said hello, and I said, "Mr. Malachi, you don't know me. My name is Ted Barris. I'm wondering if you might remember my father from the war." I hadn't even finished the sentence. And he said, "You mean Al? Al Barris, the writer from New York?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Of course I knew him. We served together." And I cried, because I realized I met a man who served with Dad. I said, "Can I come and visit you?" He said, "Of course you can. Come on down." I said, "Is there a motel nearby?" He said, "Hell, you're not going to stay in a motel. You're staying with us, your family."
Nice.
And so I went to New Jersey, Eatontown, New Jersey, right on the coast, and I spent 3 wonderful days with this man. Look at that smile. Have you ever seen a better American smile than that one? He's all there. But what I learned from Tony, in addition to his wonderful hospitality, was I learned stuff about my dad I didn't know. We all know my dad as a professional writer for television, radio, print after the war. I learned from Tony, Dad was a frustrated writer during the war. When they met at Camp Phillips in Kansas, it was my dad's bright idea to invent a newsletter for the medical battalion. So he'd go around, Tony kept saying, Dad was running around poking people saying, "Have you got any good stories, good gossip, we can put it in the newsletter?" So Dad created this newsletter, and it was called, wait for it, The Weekly Dose. That had Alex Barris all over it. And Dad wrote for it, edited it, planned it, organized it, drew together the stories. This was his real love, to distract him from the realities of the training and the war and so on. He powered through with this newsletter. In addition to that, Tony told me about the Battle of the Bulge. At the Battle of the Bulge, there were a number of sort of echelons. The front one was where my dad was with, Tony called my dad a runner. The runners managed the stretcher bearers and the frontline medics bringing in the wounded. They brought them to a first aid station, in the case of Camp Holt's Woods, this little town of Bourg. That's where, at the first aid station, Tony, who was head of the motor pool, brought together the ambulances at that spot, and they would take the wounded from there, once they were treated for first aid, back farther to hospitals or MASH units, and then out to England if need be. So that's how my dad and he worked. Dad was the runner at the front end. His job was to send in the medics to the Camp Holt's Woods. This is a very serene photograph. These guys would run through this. The problem was, in that woods and on the way to the woods were some of the most lethal defensive weapons you could imagine. Booby traps, landmines, anti-tank ditches, things called dragon's teeth, which were huge kind of pyramidal concrete structures, about 6 or 8 across, and as far as the eye could see, protecting the Germans from the invasion of motorized vehicles. And anti-tank ditches, bunkers, just lousy with material to kill and maim. And many of those injuries, wounds, would have been picked up on the way into the woods. So this is where my dad, Tony explained, was, and he was, in February of 45. Tony said to me that because of the rate of wounded arrivals, and I told you that, 1 every 6 minutes in this period, there was a real chaotic scene in this area. And my dad, sending out the medics, sent out 4 guys on the morning of the 12th of February to retrieve wounded, and he went back to the job of dealing with the first aid at the station. Most of the day goes by, and those 4 guys never came back. His job as the tech sergeant is to go and find them. So in the darkness that night, he weaves his way through the snow looking for footprints that haven't exploded, because that's where the landmines were. He retraces their steps into the woods, and one by one he finds them and brings them out, according to Tony. Some weeks later in Germany, when the medical battalion gathered, the captain brought them together, called forward my father, and gave him an award. Dad had given me the medal when I was 14, a ribbon and a gong on it. It turns out, Tony tells me, it was a Bronze Star. And what the citation says, in essence, is, Tech 4 Barris personally entered these woods, which were heavily sown with mines and booby traps, located the members of the squad. 2 of the members were wounded, 2 remaining were disoriented. He managed to extricate the members of the squad and further their evacuation through medical channels. Tony remembered my father receiving this from the captain of the medical battalion. I had no idea. So I was beginning to learn there was more than meets the eye to my father's story. And that's when the search really began. Okay, I've talked a little bit about the mythology of military medics. I've mentioned Edith Cavell. There was a movie about her released in 1939, just as the Second World War was beginning. I've mentioned MASH, we'll come back to that in a few minutes, and I've mentioned Hacksaw Ridge. Did any of you see the Band of Brothers series that came out in 2001, based on Stephen Ambrose's book? This is the story of Easy Company in the 101st Airborne Division, which lands in France and goes through Belgium and all the way to the Eagle's Nest in Germany. But in this case, they are in the Battle of the Bulge, they're surrounded at Bastogne. If you remember, there were 10 episodes in the Band of Brothers Steven Spielberg series. In episode 6, we meet a man named Eugene Rowe, who was in my first draft of the book. I really wanted him to be in this, so I researched his story, and I pulled out fascinating material about him, and then I went back to episode 6, in which Shane Taylor plays this man, and I went back over this scene, and something else struck me that I had missed. Watch this. He's come to a burned-out building, which they're using as a hospital. And here is a nurse working on a wounded man. Notice her skin complexion. And he turns, because he doesn't know why there's so many people in the bottom of this building, and talks to a doctor.
Hey, what's going on here? Why ain't this man evacuate?
We can't evacuate, we're cut off. This is as far as it goes.
What he learns there is that they're surrounded, that there's no way out. The 101st are completely surrounded at Bastogne, and they're stuck there to fend for themselves. Eugene Rowe's story is fascinating because he, like my dad, was dealing with the cold, he was dealing with the bad equipment, not enough clothing, not enough boots, and so on. They were actually taking the morphine syrettes and putting them in their armpits to keep them from freezing. That's what they were doing. But it occurred to me that the other 2 people in that very fleeting shot probably had a story. In fact, they do have a story. Turns out the African nurse was born in the Belgian Congo. She happens to be in Bastogne because she's working in Brussels at a nursing hospital and decides just before Christmas to go to Bastogne to be with her father and brother for Christmas. The doctor is a man named Jack Pryor, and he is recently transferred from one armored division to another stationed in Bastogne. So suddenly you have a black nurse and a white American doctor thrown together in the middle of the Bastogne siege. And their story is amazing, given black, white, racist army, and the fact that they had a relationship in the middle of this horrific experience. I'm not going to tell you anything more. You'll have to read it in the book. It's a great story. And by the way, Eugene Rowe hit the cutting room floor. Their story is much more interesting and never before told. So that's why it's an important and a neat story. Anyway, I move on. Other mythology associated with the stories of medical people. How about the battle in the bridge on the River Kwai? Everybody seen it? Okay? We all know that Hollywood never lets facts get in the way of telling a good story, right? And this is a classic case. In this case, this is the story of this manic, almost suicidal colonel in the POW camp who matches wits with the camp commandant, played by Sessha Hayakawa. And in the early part of the movie, there's this squaring off. And eventually, the battle of wits goes in favor of Guinness, almost at the expense of his life. But he now has control of the camp from the inside, and will build the bridge on the River Kwai on the Death Railway, which is an actual phenomenon. The bridge less so. But the point is, he's going to build this bridge the way he damn well pleases, even if it kills men within his own ranks. Here's a really important scene in which the doctor in the camp confronts Nicholson about this obsession of his. Watch this.
Hello. What's the matter with Haskins? He's got amoebic dysentery and blackwater fever. His temperature was 104 last night. Right, I see. And this man? Leg ulcers. I may be able to save the leg if I do some more cutting tonight. Do you really want to send him out to work, sir?
In other words, do you really want to collaborate with the enemy, sir? Is what he's saying. Because he's dragging people who are sick and wounded and dying or very ill to get them to build the bridge faster. And the only one who confronts them in this situation in the movie is this doctor character played by James Donald, Major Clipton. The problem is, the doctor in the camp was not British, he was Canadian. Jacob Markovitz was his name. And this is the railway they built from the Gulf of Siam deep into Burma, and the doctor in the camp wasn't a Brit, it was this man. And his story is fascinating. He comes to Canada with his family from Romania, and he gets an education at the University of Toronto, gets his medical degree there in 1923, then moves to the University of Minnesota because there's a very famous clinic there called the Mayo Clinic. And at the Mayo Clinic, he conducts experimental surgery. In 1932, he successfully takes a heart from a living dog and transplants it to another dog and successfully transplants it into the new dog. He writes about it, a book about it. 25,000 copies are sold. And he's called the dog surgeon. But what he doesn't realize is all of this experimental surgery is really putting him in good stead, preparing him for what's to come. When the war breaks out, he offers his services to the Royal Canadian Army Medical Corps, who turn him down partly because he's Jewish. He goes to Britain, they snap him up, send him to Singapore, and 7 days later the Japanese invade and he disappears into the jungle, into this camp, and no one knows if he's alive or dead. And won't know for 3 years. Because he's there in the camp, up the river, up the railway. And we don't know. And what he deals with, and what emerges after the war, is one of the most extraordinary medical stories I've ever read or heard of. In the jungle, he's dealing with all of the incredible diseases and problems that are commonplace in the jungle. Beriberi, pellagra, dysentery, just awful, awful situations. Not to mention the wounds that many of these men had as they went into the camp, and that were sustained in the building of the railway. Our doctor friend, Marco, handled all of this. There are 9,000 people in that camp. Just to give you an example of what he was up against, I'll read a little bit of, if you don't mind. Markowitz quickly discovered that the Japanese attitude in the POW camps was that the sick and injured were a nuisance. And if they died, it was the doctor's fault. His job was to prevent workers from dying. In the Chiang Kai camp, at the Siam end of the railway, he attended 9,000 patients. most suffering from tropical ulcers that bared the leg bones from the knee to the ankle. Markowitz would attempt to scrape out the stinking pulp of necrotic flesh with a sharpened spoon, but all too often gangrene would win out and there would be no alternative but amputation. He was dealing with all these diseases and all of these wounds with no utensils and no medicine. The Japanese Imperial Army allowed him nothing. He had to improvise completely. More than once, Captain Markowitz noted that the primitive hospital conditions seemed more like, quote, an environment resembling the days of Moses, end quote. Markowitz and his surgical team often operated out in the open where fresher, cleaner air might circulate and where the light was brightest. But with the out of doors would also come dust and hundreds of flies that had to be flicked off when they settled. There were men around the operating tables who did nothing but flick off the flies. Of particular note, the medical officer they knew as Marco recorded treatment for an Australian soldier who underwent an amputation at the hip. Though the medical team had anesthetized the man with a spinal injection of percaine, which is a natural substance they found in the jungle, Markowitz claimed that the patient was saved on the operating table by a technique recorded in the Old Testament. 20 minutes into the operation, the patient stopped breathing suddenly. The operating team applied artificial respiration, but since the man's chest had collapsed into the expiratory position, trying to compress his lungs proved futile. Quote, luckily there happened to be a piece of rubber tubing nearby, which we put in his mouth, Markowitz wrote. He was given artificial respiration by the method used by Elijah the Tishbite when he resuscitated the widow's child in the Bible. I'm not sure what book in the Bible it is. You can help me probably with that. Anyway, the patient's lips and nostrils were compressed and air was blown into his chest through the tube about 20 times a minute, close quote. A few whiffs of air later, the man's heart began beating again. After 40 minutes, the artificial respiration, the man could breathe on his own. Markowitz then commenced the amputation. The operation was successful. The wound healed. The patient survived. And Markowitz even recorded the soldier's first remarks upon learning about the artificial respiration. The Australian said to him, "I'm sure glad you guys don't eat onions." So he had, on top of everything else, a pretty good sense of humor. But what is remarkable is that all of this went completely unnoticed until the end of the war. When this camp was liberated, up the death railway, out comes Markowitz from the jungle, and walking with him are the people he saved. Thousands of them. He did no fewer than 3,800 transfusions. He probably did 7,000 procedures and probably saved 5,000 lives. And no one knew until the end of the war when they came out. He was awarded the Order of the British Empire by the Brits. And when the movie was produced in 1957, it got 7 Oscars and grossed $31 million. And not once in any part of the film is there the reference to the famous Canadian doctor who was part of that camp. Nowhere. Of course not. Here's a story that you probably haven't heard. You probably know, from those of you who have investigated the Korean War, that Canada sent about 27,000 troops to the Korean War and 8 tribal-class destroyers from the Royal Canadian Navy. Their job was to blockade the north. You know, the Korean Peninsula, right? 38th parallel between, with the communists to the north and the United Nations to the south across the 38th parallel. The north was blockaded by the Royal Canadian Navy destroyers, including HMCS Cayuga, who had a surgeon on board, a man named Joseph Sear, who performed many operations in the captain's quarters on his table. That became the operating table in the captain's quarters. Plummer actually had an abscessed tooth, which Dr. Sear removed carefully, safely, and solved the problem. But then he was faced with a more complicated operation in this operating theater, impromptu operating theater, when a South Korean Marine came aboard with a bullet in his chest. Sear operated and successfully removed the bullet and saved the man's life. Somebody wisely wrote up a press release on board Cayuga through the Navy, sent it back to Canada. It was published through Canadian press, all across the country in the newspapers, all well and good, until the real Dr. Sear read the story and contacted Navy to tell them they had an imposter on board HMCS Cayuga. When word got back to James Plummer and they confronted him, he ran to his cabin, Dr. Sear allegedly, and he tried to take his own life. They broke into the cabin and saved him. And that's when the story of Fred DeMera became known. He was born in the United States. 16 years old, he runs off from home to become a monk. He then takes false identity when he's in the U.S. Army, and then fakes his own suicide, leaving a pile of clothes and a suicide note on the end of a wharf. When they finally catch up with him, he spends 18 months in prison for going AWOL. At the end of the war, he goes to Canada, meets Dr. Sear, and seeks assistance learning basic medical training from the doctor, who willingly gives it to him. Then DeMera steals Sear's documents, goes to New Brunswick, presents himself to the Navy as a bona fide doctor. They take him on strength, and they send him to Korea aboard HMCS Cayuga, where he solves the captain's abscess tooth and saves the Marine with a bullet in his chest. And all of this comes to light ultimately when word gets back to the ship. He eventually was brought back to North America, charged again, served more time. But I interviewed two of the men on board HMCS Cayuga at the time, and they passed a hat among the ship's company, so that when the man got out of prison, he could actually go to medical school and learn to become, legally, a doctor. That's how much the men liked him on board, given all he'd done. And then Hollywood found out about it and made a movie about it. The Great Imposter, with Tony Curtis as Fred DeMera, a.k.a. Joseph Sear. It was a real turkey of a movie, but it was based on a true military medical story. Here's a short clip from the movie. The audio is a little bit muddy, but it's just a little trailer from the movie.
Help me, big lad. We don't want to kill anybody. I'll bet you right now the doc wishes he never set foot in the Cayuga. I know he was done with you, sir. He said, may God guide your hand. Tell him I just made the same prayer.
May God guide your hand. Tell him I just said the same prayer. So it was a bit of a dud, but it was, as I say, based on a real situation that happened in the Korean War. All right, I mentioned MASH, and there's a whole lot more here than meets the eye. We all remember the 11 or 12 years of very successful sitcom. It all came from a movie that was premiered in the theaters about 1970, written by Larry Gelbart. This man was brilliant, very funny, very capable writer, and the movie was a blockbuster hit. And so they approached him about writing a continuing situation comedy called MASH in the years following. And very brightly, Gelbart realized that you can't do 26 or 52 shows in a season just based on laughs. It had to be based on something more than that. So he spent months interviewing medics, nurses, doctors from the Korean War so that he could base the show in real situations. One of the ones that I found really interesting was an interview he did with a number of the doctors who had worked in Korea during the winter. In Korea, in the summertime, it was like the tropics, and in the winter time, it was like the Arctic. And the doctors were still working under canvas in tents for their operating theaters. It was really cold. And apparently, when they were going to do an operation where an incision was going to be made, in the operating theater in the cold, the doctors and the nurses would gather and warm their hands over the steam that rose from the operating table on the patient. Now that's pretty vivid. But then I remembered an episode which even rang more truly than that. In 1975, an episode was featured in which a fever breaks out in the camp, or in the hospital, in the MASH unit, 4077, right? And the doctors can't figure out what the hell it is. They send Father Mccrae to Tokyo. And he comes back, and here's what he has found.
It seems both the Japanese and the Russian soldiers came down with this very same kind of fever. Same symptoms, everything. From northern Manchuria during the late 30s.
Oh, what was it, Father? What are we dealing with?
It was a Japanese-American, Nisei, who was going through some old Japanese medical journals when he came across the name Hemorrhagic Fever. And he realized that we're dealing with the same thing. The doctors then were just as perplexed as you are now.
Great. We know what to call it. Only we don't know how to cure it.
There isn't a cure. The only treatment is common sense medicine.
The only treatment is common sense medicine. And as I thought about that episode and what was happening there, I remembered an interview I had done with a Korean War veteran. I met a man named Don Flieger, who was with the Royal Canadian Army Service Corps. And it was his job at Kimpo Airport, which was near Seoul, to load and unload supplies to feed the front lines, right behind the 38th parallel. And Flieger told me that he was living under canvas around the airport in tents, right? And as they did the processing of inbound and outbound supplies, they were given 9mm pistols. Not to defend themselves against the communist Chinese, but at night they lit up the area around the tents and they shot the rats, which were all over the place. And the rats were in such huge numbers, this was the only way to keep them down. But they were more than a nuisance. Mites on the rats bit your skin, and that triggered the hemorrhagic fever. You know what hemorrhagic fever is? It's Ebola. It's the plague. 8 in 10 victims of hemorrhagic fever died. Flieger woke up one morning not having covered his wrists as they were told to do when they slept in the tents. And he had a rash on his skin, which very quickly developed into blisters. And he went to a medical unit, somebody at the airport, and common sense medicine prevailed. They quickly got him to a MASH unit and they transfused him. A few days later, he was in Tokyo. They transfused him again. In Fort McLeod, they had shipped him across the Pacific, back to North America in Washington, transfused him again. On to Moncton, New Brunswick, his home, transfused him again. 4 times. They saved his life because common sense medicine had prevailed. And it was in this moment that I realized the brilliance of MASH. One, it was hysterically funny. Great comedic cast, tremendous casting, all those people. Funny scripts, had us laughing all the time. Also, because it was the time of the Vietnam War, a brilliant satire about our view of their view of Vietnam and what was happening there. But beneath it all was the reality of what it was like to be a medical team in Korea. And I don't imagine many of us thought about that. We just laughed because it was a funny show or recognized the satire. But in truth, Gelbart built into every episode something that illustrated what it was like to be a doctor, a nurse, an orderly, some sort of a medical person in Korea. And we were being instructed, educated if you like, all the while unsuspectingly. Brilliant mind, brilliant show, funny, but also true. I met modern medics, such as Dane Harden. He's a flight surgeon, served in Bosnia, Kosovo, Rwanda, Iraq, Afghanistan. His office was the back of a Black Hawk helicopter. That's where he worked as a flight surgeon. This is not he, but it's a man like him. He's harnessed in so he can't fall out. So is his patient on a carousel. But in the back of the Black Hawk helicopter, Dane Harden could administer all these things: oxygen, ventilation, IV, anything he needed to keep this man alive while that airship was flying at 140 miles an hour to get to a MASH unit to save this guy's life. That's what Dane Harden did day in and day out in Afghanistan and Iraq. He said, if we could get to the man in the critical moments after an injury and get him aboard these Blackhawks, medevaced out, there was a 97% chance they could save him. And I thought of Cloutie Mcpherson and the thousands of men who died because he couldn't get there soon enough with his mask to save them. And I thought of my dad and the 119 wounded on that 12-hour period in the Battle of the Bulge. What he wouldn't have given to be able to say, we saved 97% of the people. Couldn't happen. Tells you how far military medicine has come, that this is able to be achieved. He did, Hardin did, 122 medevac missions. He said the most rewarding part of his career was getting letters from the parents of the men and women he'd saved in combat. There is no greater job, no more satisfying job, he said, than saving the life of a soldier. One last story about my dad and me. You mentioned that I taught at Centennial College, and I did for 18 years, up to and including the beginning of the semester in 2017 in the fall. Just about this time of year, 2 years ago, after 18 years, I'm facing a new class of students, sunshiny faces, eager journalists ready to go into their new careers, and I got a note from the 94th Infantry Division Historical Society in the United States. They were leading a tour to Europe over about 10 or 12 days across the land that they had actually traveled during the war from Belgium to Germany. The land, the trek my father had made in the winter of 1945. And they were going, and there was an available spot, and did I want to go? And I turned to the dean, and I said, at the college, and I said, Dean Horowitz, I'm quitting right today. Goodbye. And he said, you crazy? And I said, maybe. But the book was done. It was finished. But I suddenly realized there was more here that I had to do. And so I went on the trip, and here's what happened. We went initially to Amsterdam, and then we came across through to the area of Bastogne. We actually went to the 101st Museum in Bastogne, and then we went to the border between Belgium or Luxembourg and Germany, and this is where the Americans first tangled with the Germans on German soil, including that spot where my dad was at Camp Holt's Woods, right? So we landed first at Nenning, which is in here, and this is what it looked like in 1945. Now we had a guide. As some of you know, I lead tours overseas every year, and the trick to that is having the capability to sort of lift the stories off the page. We had this young guide leading us across Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany, who was a PhD student in history, doing a degree or a PhD paper on the 94th Infantry Division. So he was fairly knowledgeable. But if you've ever known somebody who did a PhD, you know that not only writing it, you have to defend it. And you have to recite it in front of an audience. Well, he had a captive audience of 35 Americans and 1 Canadian on this entire tour. So every once in a while, he'd sit us down and we'd read from the PhD, which was the boringest thing I've ever experienced. Anyway, we get to Nenning, just across the border, and he brings us to the square where he starts to read from his PhD. This was the place that the Americans and the Germans first clashed on German soil. And somebody in the group, the 35 Americans and 1 Canadian, somebody said, where were the civilians during this battle? And the young Dutch PhD student, he was 25 or 26, he said, oh, they'd all been evacuated. And he went on with his talk. And a guy behind me said, well, that's not exactly true. And I turned around and I faced Al Theobald from San Diego. And I said, I shook his hand because I hadn't met him yet, because we were just, this was our first stop. And I said, why did you say that? He said, well, I was born near here in Germany right after the war, and that wasn't my mother's experience. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, after Borg was liberated, the town in which he grew up, he said, my mother came back to the farmhouse after the Americans had used it and found it full of medical supplies. And I said, medical supplies? He said, yeah. Bandages and medicine. Our home was a first aid station, and the hair on the back of my neck is up. I'm thinking, well, wait a minute. We're close to where my dad was. I said, where is this place called Borg, where you lived and where this first aid station was? He said, oh, about a mile from Camp Holt's Woods. And I realized that this man had lived, grown up in, the home, the farmhouse, which during the war had been my dad's first aid station. I could barely keep my heart in my skin. I was so excited. And I said to him, can we go there? He said, sure. And he took me. Here's again the map. Borg, Campholz. And that's what it looks like today. Pretty innocuous, gorgeous little forest on the top of a hill. But in the time of 1945, lethal, absolutely deadly for those 4 guys. In fact, that my dad managed to get out of there could have been the end for them, and probably was for many others based on the research that I did. And we went into the woods, Al and I, and there were old bunkers all torn up because this was all blown up or during the battle disturbed, and there was all kinds of debris still around 75 years later. Anyway, and then he took me to Borg. We went through the town, and then we went to his home. And I stood there and realized that that was the place my dad had brought the 4 guys on the 12th of February, 1945, and I was there on the very spot. And I fell down in a heap. I could barely contain my emotions. And I came home, and I rewrote the whole book. Because, as close as I'd been to my father's story, which is threaded through the middle of it, I didn't have that story. And I found many more on this trip. 2 vets were with us on the trip through Luxembourg and Germany who had been with the 94th, and they had stories about medics. And they had stories about their experiences in this stretch of the Battle of the Bulge that I didn't have. So my decision to leave my job at Centennial, crazy though it might have been, was probably the best thing for the book, because it's richer, it's deeper, it's more accurate than it was in the first or second draft, because now it's got the heart of what my dad went through. And I realized that Al Theobald had taken me closer to my dad's experience than I'd ever been before, and in a larger sense, closer to understanding why medics rush to danger. Thank you. Any questions? We got time for questions? What time do we have to be out?
Oh, about now, but that's okay.
About now?
Take
Okay.
5 or 10 minutes.
Do you want to, anybody got any questions? Based on my kind of quick, there's so much more in this thing because of the stories. Somebody was asking me earlier about, you know, whether there were First World War stories, and there's a great deal more in here. Spanish Civil War. I trace, you see, what I decided to do was I wasn't dependent just on the interviews, but also my research. Do you know when the first field ambulance was invented? At a place called Fredericksburg in 1862 during the Civil War. And I tracked down the man who invented it, at least his story, a man named Jonathan Letterman. And he was the creator of the first military medical operations during the Civil War. Generally speaking, they just hoofed the wounded into wagons and hauled them away, and quacks carved them up because they figured that was the best way of dealing with the injuries. Letterman turned the entire Union Army of the Potomac upside down and created a medical force within the Army that served the wounded like they'd never been served before. And it comes into effect at Fredericksburg in December of 1862. So I go all the way back to there. And then, as I suggested to you, I went all the way through to the flight surgeons in Afghanistan and Iraq and all the people in between. Anyway, yes?
I listen to Brian Goldman every week. How did you hook up with him?
He and I are both published by the same publisher.
Oh.
So we approached him and asked him to read the manuscript, which he readily did, and he offered, as you'll see in the book, an introduction which is quite appropriate. He recognizes what I was trying to do in the book, and he sets it up rather nicely in the introduction. Yeah.
One thing is that medical people also help each other.
Yeah.
And my grandmother, on the way back home on a troop ship, got typhoid. And the only person, the reason she survived is because the other nurses nursed her around the clock and kept her fever down. And then she ends up in Toronto. She's pregnant, has twins, my mother, my aunt. They should never have survived.
But they did, thanks to the fact that they helped each other and recognized each other's problems.
Now every soldier's trained for combat first aid.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's called PEEPS, P-E-E-P-S. I can't remember what it stands for, but that's what the training's called.
If I think of long enough, I might remember.
Yeah, it's somewhere in the book, I just can't remember what, it's an acronym. Donna, thank you so much for bringing the cake
You're welcome.
and the stories and sharing them with us.
Welcome, and
'cause
thank you for putting them in the book. They're here tonight. They're very thankful.
They are, yeah.
Yeah. I think there were many times during your talk that I felt a shiver go down my spine at some of the coincidences.
Yeah, it's quite strange, isn't it?
It is, it is. Anyway, I'd like to thank you very much